Hello. This is my second attempt at recording the 1920s lecture. Let's see how this goes. We're going to look at the consumerism that developed after World War I, how the progressive era came to an end, and describe and discuss the major changes of American society during the 1920s, which were many. After the war, remember that during World War I, we have a tightly managed wartime economy. The War Industries Board, lots of propaganda, controlling victory bonds, the Sedition Acts, those kinds of things. We have a very tightly controlled society, very tightly controlled economy. In the 1920s is this period of major consumption and production following this tightly managed economy. Remember that as soon as the armistice is signed, as soon as we know in November of 1918 that the war is over, it's kind of like hands off. Oh, well, gee, we don't need to manage the economy anymore, and the government completely lifts its hands. And this kind of creates a very different kind of business environment for companies, and this is part of what leads us to the 1920s as it is, or as we know it. So we're going to look at manufacturing that's up by 64%, an economy that grows by 7% per year. However, the booming economy is largely an illusion of credit. This economic growth is due to poor information. People that are borrowing money to buy goods, and there's no attention to the fact of the debt ratio, companies that have too much supply, and they don't keep track of that. So we can talk about how manufacturing is up and the economy grows, but there's other factors that come into this that indicate an economy that was actually very weak. And you have to take that into consideration as well. So it's not all as straightforward as it would seem. Keep in mind this little chart here shows you some of the major technological developments that we have, as well as some of the economic developments, as well as who was in charge. As you can see, Calvin Coolidge is the president in charge for the majority of the 1920s, with a little bit of Warren Harding, followed by Hoover, followed by Wilson. And you can see that we have major changes to society, major technological developments, and the technology that develops rapidly leads to new products, new development, new production techniques, that leads to a large supply, which leads to a large amount of advertising. We have a huge demand for goods. This demand for goods leads to high employment and ultimately to higher wages, although it's not as simple as that sounds. Like everything else in society and American history, it's more complex than just what's on the surface. So while on the surface we'll look at this period and we'll say new products, new technology, new wages, lots of people at work, the reality is there's cracks in the foundation that are threatening to bring down the entire economy. And indeed, that is what happens in 1929. This shows you right here that the concentration of wealth was dominated in a small percentage of the population. So this is not a concentration of wealth that is spread out among the ordinary citizens. This is a concentration of wealth that is focused on the top 1%, on those that are largely in charge of the businesses and what's going on. What does this mean exactly? Well, what this means is that the middle class, the people that consume day in and day out, week in and week out, that go to the store, that buy the clothes, that buy the cars, that buy the radios, those people are not experiencing income growth. The wealthiest individuals are experiencing growth. But there's only so many, high-tech gadgets you can buy. A wealthy individual can only have so many iPads, so many 60-inch TVs, so much high-tech before there's really no point to any of this. So just kind of keep that in mind, and that this is really one of the significant weaknesses of the 1920s, is this concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. We see here post-World War I cynicism, this idea that what was it all for? Why does it really matter that we got sucked into this conflict because of business, because of banking? So I'm going to look out for myself because, after all, the businesses are going to look after themselves. And so we have this initial period after World War I, once we shut off the wartime economy and people kind of freak out. And so when people freak out, you kind of have this reaction, right? And you're going to have a contraction in the economy, and people are going to lose some jobs, and wages are going to go down, and all that kind of stuff. But because of the demand for goods, because you have these soldiers coming back home, because you have all these new products, the economy is going to rebound fairly quickly. And there's more to this than just the simplistic idea of, well, people come back from war and they want new stuff. There's some supply-side economics at work here and that kind of thing. But by and large, what you have is kind of a quick rebound. And so you're going to have that, you're going to have lots of interesting new items like radios, lots of industries that are developing. You're going to have lots of people with extra money to spend. Because of the managed economy, they weren't able to spend as much as they wanted to. And people are going to start spending, right? And buying radios, buying cars, buying, refrigerators and that kind of thing. And ultimately, they'll spend more income than they make, right? And if you know anything about credit, anything about supply and demand, you know that too much credit spending is a bad thing, especially if it's spending on disposable goods, goods that don't hold value. And so you begin to see that happens, and you have this general idea of isolationism that occurs, where people keep saying, well, we're going to make this, whole thing, be profitable because of all of this. And, we don't have to rely on markets overseas. We can rely on our domestic, markets. And, we've talked about this going back to the Gilded Age and kind of the age of imperialism. So there's really nothing new about that. Just kind of keep in mind that this kind of resurges after the 1920s in a big way. The idea that the United States can consume everything that it makes. And they fund this largely through consumer credit, through people borrowing money to buy stuff. And the problem is that won't last for forever. Okay, so we've talked about how kind of the post-war cynicism leads to this kind of boom in consumerism. We also have lots of factory production, convenience goods, automobiles, canned goods, and construction. These can create all kinds of sub-industries that go into these. No one industry by itself exists in a bubble, right? I mean, if you have an automobile industry, you're going to have glass manufacturers, you're going to have tire manufacturers, you're going to have people that make all the different parts, that kind of thing. So you have a huge amount of kind of construction and sub-industries that are kind of making jobs and creating a huge boom. You're also going to have a real estate boom happening. Primarily the real estate boom is going to happen in California and Florida. California because of the movie industry. Florida because, well, it's Florida and the temperature's nice. And people are going to start building lots of construction. Building houses and that kind of thing to make things better. Make kind of luxury houses. So most of the famous people from the 1920s are going to have homes in Florida. But you also have construction in the cities. You have construction in suburbs. Kind of housing, bridges, you name it, any kind of construction. And in fact, some of this construction will lead to problems in the late 1920s when you have Florida hit by concurrent hurricanes in the late 20s. The Mississippi River Valley gets hit by flooding. And these things are going to affect the real estate market. And as we'll look at when we start talking about the Great Depression and the stock market crash, the effects of these real estate crashes are going to have ripple effects throughout the entire economy. So you're going to see that happens. Here's some pictures of some canned goods. Lots of developments of products, whether it's the safety razor, so men don't have to rely on the straight edge razor, or whether you're talking about sliced bread. Because yes, prior to the 1920s, you sliced your own bread. You didn't go to the store and buy already sliced bread. You had to do it yourself. So you have this man invent the bread slicer, and this becomes quite a hot button issue. So you have lots of, things like that kind of drive people and drive consumption. We also see that the automobile happens. The automobile changes society in all kinds of radical ways, from the fact that young people can now go on dates, and they can spend time together away from their families, or whether you're talking about women that can drive into the cities and enjoy the movies and restaurants and that kind of thing, or speakeasies. So the automobile has a profound change because of the increased transportation. No longer are you isolated if you live 30 miles outside of town, because it's just a short drive into town before you get to experience all the kind of modern developments that you see thanks to electricity, thanks to the movies and that kind of thing. So the automobile has a huge profound on society. The assembly line lowers prices. Henry Ford standardizes the way he makes automobiles. This lowers prices, which makes automobiles affordable for everybody, which means it doesn't matter what your social class is. You can have access to a car to take you into town. And so you have really kind of, the assembly line. And remember, Henry Ford does not invent the assembly line. The assembly line had been around for several decades. What Henry Ford does is he perfects it. He gets it down to a fine art. He takes all the best of scientific management from the Progressive era and combines it with the assembly line to create his unique version of the assembly line. And of course, it helps that he streamlines the production so that he's only producing cars in black, and cars with a very set number of kind of options, as opposed to the customized versions that we saw from the wealthy individuals prior to, say, 1915. And so, yes, Henry Ford becomes a big deal, the way he creates the Model T, and the impact of the Model T on the overall society. And we see that increased production means consumption, and the need to increase production and consumption to keep sales and profits high. So it doesn't much matter what you're talking about. If you're talking about an automobile, if you're talking about a radio, if you're talking about cola, if you're talking about Listerine. Listerine creates the concept of halitosis, which is completely a made-up illness. It's a Greek word that means bad breath, and the Listerine company makes that up to sell its breath control products. Lots of advertising that comes out there to convince people they absolutely need things. And so you see that this is kind of part of the economic boom, and this is built upon the idea of debt and the idea of consumption and consumerism, that I just have to have the latest gadget, the latest toy, the latest thing to be modern, to keep up with everybody else. And so I will go into debt. I will borrow money. I will spend instead of save in order to have the latest goods. So really our modern consumer society comes from the 1920s. Prior to the 1920s, Americans didn't think this way. So it's a profound change in American society in a lot of ways. We see, this is a picture of an automobile. Again, think of all the different industries that come into the automobiles. Think of the impact on society and how it takes the urban influence and kind of includes people that live farther away because they can hop in a car and drive there. Now, Henry Ford doesn't just rely on his assembly line. He does, right? His assembly line changes everything. But the other thing that Henry Ford does is he talks about the doctrine of high wages. Essentially, he says that I'm going to pay my workers well enough that they can buy the cars that they make, which is really kind of a profound difference if you think about the Gilded Age. And the fact that the Gilded Age said that, workers' wages are part of how I make my profit margin. I don't have to worry about how much money my workers make or how happy they are. Instead, I can just, milk them for all I can. Well, Henry Ford said no, that makes, workers that are not loyal, that makes workers that are vulnerable to unions, and that eliminates part of your customer base. And so Henry Ford starts talking about paying your workers well, kind of this concept of high wages and welfare capitalism, that we're going to pay our workers enough, we're going to give them benefits, we're going to help them, make this all worth their time, essentially. It's kind of what we see, and it attracts a lot of people to his factory. Now, the problem with the sociology department and the doctrine of high wages is that you have Henry Ford perceiving that he gets to micromanage the lives of his workers. If I'm going to pay you so well, if I'm going to give you all these opportunities, then, if I don't like what you do with your free time, then I can come and criticize you. If I don't like, what church you go to, if I don't like which saloon you hang out with, if I don't like, the fact that you have visitors staying at your house for 2 weeks, and I think that's a problem, then I can come tell you about it. So you have a lot more interest in kind of micromanagement by Henry Ford because of the doctrine of high wages. So it's not all well and good. And certainly we see here, this is from the Dearborn Independent, from his kind of company magazine that talks about how we have to be wary of Jews, and he's very anti-Semitic, very anti-black, although he hired black workers. But that doesn't mean that he liked black culture and that he liked the influence of black culture on American society. So Henry Ford, while he does a lot of good things, he's not necessarily a straightforward, yay, go America kind of person. He does some things that we might question, that certainly people in the 1920s questioned, let alone people in 2015, with the way he micromanaged his workers and with some of the attitudes that he had. He was very much kind of a pro-Hitler guy, at least until Hitler starts, declaring war on everybody. So we have kind of this doctrine of high wages and how Henry Ford interprets it. We see that business, by and large, rejects progressive control, rejects wartime controls. They begin to form national change and oligopolies where a handful of individuals basically dictate an industry. Kind of a return to the monopoly system, except there's such an anti-progressive feeling that nobody cares, right? Nobody cares that we're having the emergence of monopolies again. Nobody cares that workers are struggling. It's just kind of one of those things that's happening. And some workers are actually benefiting from the system. The industries that have the doctrine of high wages, that have benefits, that have programs in place, those workers are doing okay. And there's enough of those that they kind of offset the balance of those that aren't doing so well. But make no mistake, this is not kind of a monolithic, everyone was doing great kind of mentality, which is what the term the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age might imply. In fact, you have a lot of industrial workers who are actually struggling quite a bit in the 1920s that haven't benefited from the doctrine of high wages, that are still struggling in very much a Gilded Age kind of environment. So just understand that we're kind of in this transition period. And that you do have some improvements. You do have business to some extent attempting to address the problems of the Gilded Age, realizing that, well, if we ignore working conditions, if we ignore working hours, we're going to encourage our workers to join unions, and we don't like unions, and we don't want those, right? And so they do start to make some small steps in that direction. But that by no means results in kind of an across-the-board improvement. It just means that there's pockets of improvement for working people. In addition, you have kind of these large businessmen, these oligopolies creating mergers where they're kind of combining companies to streamline things, protect that profit margin. And there's lots of stock price manipulation. Keep in mind that we don't have the systems in place that guarantee fairness in stock trading, that guarantee honesty. So these guys can cook the books however they want, and they merge companies, create these large industry chains, and they do this so that a handful of individuals will make a ton of money from stock prices while everybody else just kind of muddles along. So we have kind of this emerging kind of, profit margin is the key. Protecting the stock market price is the most important thing for a lot of these people. Now, a lot of these businessmen do protect the idea of, progressive efficiency. They do look for scientific management and what it brought to the table. And so they don't totally do away with all those aspects of progressivism. They just get rid of some of the regulation and control. We also see that they destroy unions through welfare capitalism. By encouraging workers to have stock purchase plans, they provide limited benefits and better conditions. But again, this is not universal. And it sounds good, but implementation is sketchy at best. So you have many people that are still struggling industrial families that aren't making ends meet. You still have child labor. You still have these pockets of things, even though you have examples where industry is doing something other than just kind of grinding its workers under the wheels. So just kind of understand that the 1920s is not perfect for workers, but you do begin to see some small improvements that at least mean that unions are not very powerful and that kind of thing. And this cartoon on this slide kind of indicates to you that they could throw out this idea of employee stock purchase as a way of kind of getting workers to feel bought into the system, and yet that doesn't necessarily mean that the workers are benefiting from it. This is similar to the 401k program that we see now. It's a little bit different. The 401k program now allows workers to have more control over where their contributions go. This kind of system was straightforward. I own stock in my company. And I don't have any control on how my company does other than what I do individually. So you see that there's kind of a difference there. So I don't want you to think that this is identical to the 401k program. But this cartoon kind of says it all as to what we can expect from the 1920s in the working environment. Okay, so we also have a general lack of interest by the government for regulation. All the interests that you've seen under Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson to bust up trusts are generally gone under the presidents of the 1920s. And you're going to see that kind of the effect of the Palmer raids of the early 1920-21 and just the general support of local authorities in favor of business owners is going to generally discourage unions by and large. So you're going to really see the decline of union membership during the 1920s. Hello, why are we not changing pages? There we go. Hello. There we go. My computer's losing its mind. We also see that mass marketing and advertising equals Americanization. The 1920s is a period of really profound kind of American culture. Less control by local communities thanks to the automobile, thanks to kind of a nationalized popular culture that is due to the radio, that is due to the movies. You're going to have changing standards with new women, free love, impersonal kind of standards and personal behavior, kind of an idea of alienation among workers, among individuals, and a general permissiveness. Do what feels good. Do what feels right in the moment. You're going to have the speakeasies and the alcohol culture emerging because of Prohibition, and what we call the lost generation of writers and artists that really depict this kind of post-World War I attitude of what was it all for? Why do we want to sacrifice and put other needs ahead of ourselves? Why not live for the moment and live for pleasure, live for what feels good? And so you really kind of have a changing standard from the Gilded Age and kind of that Victorian age attachment to this is the right thing to do, this is proper behavior, and the progressive attachment for, we're going to fight for what's right. And to very much a take care of yourself kind of attitude that emerges in the 1920s. Knowing F. Scott Fitzgerald is a very important name. He is, kind of the quintessential, American author. Notice I misspelled Fitzgerald's name here on the PowerPoint. And you have lots of, art and that kind of thing that depicts the same kind of frustration. We're also going to see the new woman. Changing standards are going to reflect kind of a value of athleticism. Women who have kind of slim, boyish figures, women who have short hair, women who are tan, right? It used to be that an upper-class woman was pale and delicate and kind of had that hourglass figure. Now in the 1920s, you have women that are straight and slim, that are athletic, that are tan, that play tennis, that play outside. And you have kind of this whole new attitude about women. Women who are educated, women who work as secretaries, as support staff. You have women who are active in their communities. You have women who are doing things, women who are voting, thanks to the 19th Amendment that takes place. You're going to have women who are assertive. They can be sexually active, many of them, not all of them, but some. Kind of an unconcern for social control. I can do what feels right. If it feels right to have short hair, if it feels right to wear a revealing dress, I can do so. Kind of this idea of independence and education. And this is true even though many of the jobs that women do are feminized and they typically are paid less than men, but it's still kind of breaking new ground for women in general. And then, of course, we do have the 19th Amendment, where women are allowed to vote. And, of course, this new morality of womanhood kind of lays to rest this idea that women were somehow morally superior, and that they would bring their moral superiority into the voting booth. Women are just ordinary people. And we certainly see that regardless of having the 19th Amendment, women continue to be just ordinary people. And so you have really a major change in standard and in the behavior of women during this period that you really can't get away from. It's a part of the impact of the automobile. It's a part of the impact of the speakeasy. It's a part of the impact of the 19th Amendment. No one aspect leads to this new woman. But all these things together definitely lead to a new sort of woman in American history. So just kind of keep that in mind. We have media and celebrity that emerged during this period thanks to the talking movies, thanks to the radio. You're going to have print media that's going across the country thanks to transportation and the automobile that ties in small rural communities, suburban communities with the large cities. So we have one national culture, which means two very singular kinds of celebrities, whether you're talking Rudolph Valentino, who's a silent film star from the movie The Sheik. My thought was, 50 Shades of Grey before 50 Shades of Grey ever existed. And you certainly have him being very famous when he dies of a bleeding ulcer in the late 1920s. Women are like throwing themselves on the ground and fainting, and there's even a couple women who commit suicide because they're so distraught over his death. Charles Lindbergh, who in 1927 has the transatlantic flight, he becomes a celebrity. Babe Ruth, as a baseball player, becomes a celebrity. And so we have kind of the rise of these individual celebrities and this kind of alienated culture. And so kind of keep those names in mind because they were a part of this 1920s society. Recreation becomes a part of everyday life. Sports, dancing fads, jazz music are all major cultural developments. And in fact, jazz music is a significant impact by black culture in American life. And it's going to be the dominance of jazz music that I think really kind of illustrates a lot about the Roaring Twenties. In fact, we call it the Jazz Age, and it's no mistake that we do. The Great Migration had brought black musicians northward. These musicians go into these bars and these clubs, and they start playing a new type of music, and it becomes incredibly popular all over the country. It becomes incredibly popular all over the world. In fact, this is the first kind of genre of music that starts in the American society and really impacts the world in kind of a preview of what globalization will eventually become. And so it's from this that we go and we start looking at the rise of the new Negro. Okay, so this takes us to, if I can get this to change for me. There we go. Come back here. There we are. To the new Negro. The Great Migration that, really kind of begins 1914, 1915. As the United States is starting to make ammunitions and other products for Britain and France in World War I, these job opportunities attract blacks from the southern states. Blacks who are frustrated with sharecropping, that are frustrated by the lack of opportunity, frustrated by the violence, the lynching, the KKK, the Jim Crow segregation. They get attracted up north for jobs. And so, really, this even heightens after World War I, after black soldiers fought in Europe, after they come home and they feel like, we fought for democracy and yet we come back to the same old stuff, right? And then, of course, if you think back to the post-World War I era, immediately after, like in the 1920, not actually the year 1920, you're going to have race riots, riots over housing, that kind of stuff, blacks that lose their jobs. So there's a great deal of frustration in the black community. And this causes the black community to kind of focus on a cultural awakening, kind of a culture that talks about, let's be proud to be black, let's be proud to be American, that we've contributed to this American story. And so you begin to see that they have a lot of cultural pride. You have the emergence of black nationalism, the idea that blacks are going to take care of blacks. And all of this will lead to the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance being kind of an overall term, although it does talk about the community of Harlem in New York City specifically. It also refers to a large number of black artists, writers, musicians that really kind of embrace a unique cultural element of black Americans. Literature from their perspective, music from their perspective, art from their perspective. Art and music and literature that talks about being proud of being black, not being ashamed of it. And this is has a huge impact really on American literature and certainly on American music if you look at jazz and blues music, that kind of thing. And so this picture kind of shows you not only kind of an idea of what the Harlem Renaissance was about, but you see there's a picture of a black family as they're getting ready to leave on a train to move up north, and a painting by a black artist that really depicts kind of the black communities up north. Whether you're talking about Chicago, Detroit, New York, Harlem, whatever, you have a lot of black communities that have left the South, that have given up on trying to ever change or make the South work for them. And so this is really kind of the essence of the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is certainly the dominant kind of black cultural experience of the 1920s. It's into this that we see the NAACP begins to really come into its own. It was created in 1906, 1907 as the Niagara Falls Movement, changes its name in 1909 to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they began to use a lot of the same tactics that we saw that the women's suffrage movement used with parades. They do begin to, up north, start to vote in blocks to control local elections. And so the NAACP begins to practice this method of taking things through the court system and challenging laws in the courts. That begins really in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, and really begins to be effective in the 1930s and 1940s. So the NAACP kind of comes from this period. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican immigrant who comes into the United States, begins to talk about black nationalism, black businesses for black customers, creates the United Negro Improvement Association, which is kind of like an insurance company for black Americans, for disability, for death, for life insurance, for burial insurance, workers' compensation, those kinds of things, to encourage blacks to kind of take care of their own, to not have to rely on white society. He also talks about blacks separating from white society, that white society will never treat them fairly, will never be honest with them. And so why are we trying to participate in this white American society? That they won't notice until we're gone how much we brought to the table. And so he begins to talk about this black nationalism. And he's really the beginning, if you look at kind of the development of the black civil rights movement as it emerges after the Civil War, you're going to have Reconstruction, which of course will be wound down. Men like Booker T. Washington will talk about accommodation. Just give us the chance to earn $1. We don't want political rights. Contrast that with Du Bois, who says, no, we absolutely have to have political rights. Here comes Marcus Garvey, who says you can't trust whites to do the right thing. They're always going to be stacked against us, regardless of where they're from. And he's going to kind of push back against that. You start thinking about the NAACP bringing court cases to bear in the 30s and 40s. We're going to see the ultimate impact of the integration of the armed forces, thanks to A. Philip Randolph, the Brown v. Board decision. And then you're going to see the emergence of leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, who on the surface look to be very different from each other. But in reality, they're all talking about different ways that the black community can achieve a level of respect and kind of ownership in this larger American system. And Marcus Garvey is one of those names that happens early on. Now, his suggestion that blacks need to separate from white society, that they can't trust white society, will actually kind of come back to bite him, because what will happen is that middle-class blacks who are making it successfully in American society are going to resent his suggestion that they should just throw in the towel and move back to Africa, that forget the white society here, forget the American system, and they're going to kind of take it personally. And they're not going to like that very much. Oh, excuse me. And white society's not going to like his kind of anti-white message. And so he will ultimately be found guilty of mail fraud because of his Black Star Line, which was a cruise line that was meant to take blacks from the United States to Liberia for resettlement. And they'll kind of come out against him, and he'll eventually get deported back to Jamaica. So he's an important figure to kind of be aware of in this whole process. So if you look at kind of this new society with the NAACP and Marcus Garvey, we're going to see kind of an irony in that in the midst of all this new women, new culture, new blacks, new music, new cultural integration, there's a fundamental backlash to defend American society, or what is perceived as American society. A lot of this has to do with the fact that local communities that have been very homogenous, very much the same all these years, that when you start throwing in the automobile and kind of the influences of a modern culture, they begin to feel very fractured and very threatened. And fundamentalism is the response that comes from this. You also have a fear of immigrants, through kind of this idea of immigration controls. Sacco and Vanzetti is a famous court case where two Italian immigrants who can't hardly even speak English get found guilty and executed. So you have those kinds of things. You're going to have kind of this religious fundamentalism, this biblical literalism that emerges, and a new version of the Ku Klux Klan that comes out of this period. All of this is kind of related to this fear of what is the impact of all this newness, right? That it's challenging everything that we know. Some of this has to do with the backlash against the controls of prohibition and women getting the right to vote and jazz music, for instance. But some of it is just kind of goes back to the good old-fashioned kind of nativism that we saw popping up periodically back from 1892, thanks to the immigrants. Of course, the real irony is that while we have an Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and a National Origins Act of 1924 that control the number of people that can come into this country based on, nationality statistics going back to 1910, and it does slow the flow of European immigrants, we don't slow the flow of Mexican immigrants. Of course, that makes sense given that blacks are moving up north and leaving agricultural jobs in the south, and we need agricultural workers. And, of course, the Mexican Civil War has created kind of chaos there. So we don't change Mexican immigration, but we definitely limit European immigration. And this is what Larson's book is referring to. These immigration quotas, as well as the LPC clause that kind of keeps, Jewish Germans from escaping to the United States in the 1930s. The new KKK emerges. This picture here of the KKK marching in Washington, D.C., 1924, 1926, something like that. The new KKK comes out against the modern woman, against black cultural influence. They're nativist, and they do this to gain support all over the country. So they're not just against blacks as far as the southern states, but they're against the new modern woman for rural communities. They're against immigrants in working communities. So there's something about the KKK for everybody in a lot of ways. They also use a lot of modern kind of promotional techniques to build up their membership. They create a pyramid system by which people join and they pay dues, and the person you pay dues to gets to keep a portion of that. And as they keep a portion of that, they also then, go from that to, they kick that on up to the next person, that kind of thing. So you kind of see that, that really, the KKK becomes a very modern organization. This is the organization that we're familiar with now. And so you just need to kind of realize that eventually they'll be, minimized by corruption and scandal because of the pyramid system. And plus, jazz music is really popular. And while there are people that don't like the prevalence of jazz music, don't like the number of immigrants, you also have a lot of people that do. And so the KKK, while they'll maintain kind of their membership numbers, they'll cease to be kind of the strong influence in American politics, thanks to all of this by roughly 1925, 1926. And it's into this that you're going to have Prohibition and the 18th Amendment. Of course, this is enacted just as Wilson's leaving office, and Republican control will come in and slim down government agencies because they're cutting government budgets, trying to cut costs. So we'll have the 18th Amendment, we'll have the Volstead Act that will allow for police powers, but they won't give very much money for the enforcement of it. And so this is going to be a major problem that we see. In addition, you're going to have that hard liquor is far more profitable for the speakeasies than, say, beer or wine. So really, if you want to go have a drink to celebrate, a promotion or an anniversary, or if you've just had a really hard week and you want to go get a drink to unwind, suddenly you're sent to a speakeasy where you're committing a small crime, and, hey, if I got to commit a small crime, I might as well make it worth my time. And then you've got business owners that are running the speakeasies that make a higher profit margin by having hard liquor rather than beer and wine. So they encourage people to drink a lot more bathtub gin or imported whiskey or something like that. And all of this encourages kind of this alcohol culture. Speakeasies with jazz music, and you've got kind of this, open door where men, women, married, not married, black, white, everybody gets to come to the speakeasy. We're all committing crimes, so we're all kind of the same in that sense. And so some of the cultural divisions, some of the social divisions that you might see existing outside the speakeasy don't apply there. And so this kind of leads to a social melting pot where, even though the middle class and religious fundamentalism continue to think that prohibition is a good thing and that if we just stick with it a little bit longer, it will have an effect, by and large, the majority of Americans will begin to resent it. And you'll have resentment among middle class, among the working class, among the upper class. And so it really becomes a social melting pot where you're either for it or you're against it. And regardless of where you fall on that, you're going to have all kinds of strange bedfellows. And in the meantime, you're going to have lots of organized crime because this is criminal behavior. So organized crime provides the alcohol. They provide the speakeasies that allow people to consume alcohol. And so organized crime becomes a thing. In fact, one of the things that will happen by 1932, in addition to the fact that the federal government will realize they're missing out on all kinds of tax dollars by taxing alcohol, is that organized crime will very clearly be racking up a huge body count. And so no longer can the middle class, the religious fundamentalists, look at, prohibition and say, oh, well, this is making our society better, because very clearly it's introducing far more violence to cities. And they can't deny that any longer. So organized crime is an element of this, the speakeasies, and then, like I said, the social melting pot that emerges because of prohibition. It's into this that you're going to have fundamentalism, which is dominant in the kind of rural and suburban areas. And fundamentalism emerges in the 1920s, and kind of this atmosphere after World War I that, everything's kind of meaningless. What did we fight the war for? Kind of this aimless, alienated attitude. Fundamentalism is going to emerge. And fundamentalism is going to say that this alienation is the result of religious modernism, religious pragmatism, that kind of looked at religion and science as equal. Remember that modern Christians, up until the fundamentalism of the 1920s, had no problem with looking at Charles Darwin. Matter of fact, they could accept the existence of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, just like they could accept the existence of the Bible. And for them, these things were not mutually exclusive. But given what happens after World War I, you're going to have, and the changes that are happening in society, religious fundamentalism is going to say that religious modernism has lost its meaning. It's not giving people what they really need, and that we need a back to the Bible approach, which actually means back to biblical literalism. And you can see this cartoon up at the top left shows you the descent of the modernists, who start out with not believing the Bible is infallible, falling all the way down to atheism. And this is very much kind of what the fundamentalists perceived, is that they had to fight that. And so they have a lot of kind of evangelical preachers, tent revivals, and these guys use very modern techniques, just like the KKK did, radio, film, kind of mass meeting kind of things, to get people to come in and hear their message. And they, this picture on the bottom right is a picture of Billy Sunday, who was a famous evangelist from the period. And these guys certainly kind of talk about fundamentalism, going back to the Bible, believing in the Word of God as infallible. And they kind of start seeing Christianity as having to oppose the methods of science. So in a way, it's almost a reaction against progressivism. Just like business is reacting against all the progressive control, we see that religion is reacting against kind of this balanced approach. Remember that the social gospel was all about taking this kind of scientific approach and blending it with Christian values. And biblical fundamentalism is going to say we need to lose the scientific approach, that's what's damaged Christianity, and this is what's made so many kids, aimless and wandering around and falling into jazz and music and all this kind of stuff, and that they need some kind of meaning in their life besides that. And so they're going to have a lot of nativism, the belief that, religion as it exists in, South Carolina or Virginia or Indiana is the answer. And so that people that come from other countries don't have kind of the awareness of who God is. And Darwinism and science are going to become a major target. Even though Darwinism and evolution had existed with Christianity for about 60 years. And you're going to see that religious fundamentalism will really be a kind of a backlash against this. The Scopes trial, I checked my link earlier and it's not working. This is a song, You Can't Make a Monkey Out of Me. You have a passing in Tennessee in 1924 of a Butler Act, which makes the teaching of evolution illegal in Tennessee. And everyone thinks, okay, well that's fine. It's just kind of a fundamentalist backlash and nobody thinks much of it. Except a newly formed American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, decides to test the law, and they kind of make arrangements with this guy by the name of John Scopes that he will teach evolution in a classroom with a Tennessee-approved textbook that had been cleared for adoption prior to the Butler Act. And the city of Dayton, Tennessee, who wants to kind of raise, kind of as a promotional campaign, hey, look at us, we're a good old-fashioned country, or good old-fashioned city, don't you want to bring your business here, that kind of thing. And, hey, we're going to get some tourist dollars from all of this. Everyone kind of knows ahead of time that this case is going to happen there. And so John Scopes is a substitute teacher. He goes in, he teaches from this biology textbook, teaches about evolution. He gets fined and a ticket. He appeals it, goes to court, and they have a trial. And at the trial, basically, you have William Jennings Bryan arguing for the state of Tennessee. Yes, that William Jennings Bryan, the populist/Democrat, who was the great speaker. By now, he's much older. And he's arguing that absolutely the Bible is infallible, and that kind of thing. And then you have Clarence Darrow arguing for John Scopes, arguing that you can't dismiss science, that the Butler Act is, not legal, that it doesn't apply. And you have really kind of this hot button issue between these different guys. And the question really is, to what extent religious beliefs and local standards control education? And so they will argue back and forth over this case. And really it doesn't become so much about John Scopes. John Scopes, his conviction is actually upheld. He appeals it to the Supreme Court, to which the Supreme Court basically kind of says, yeah, we don't want to mess with this anymore, and they kind of kick it on down the road. So the case really becomes about science versus the Bible, and so it's famous in that element between Darrow and Bryan. It's also famous because it's this great example of American fundamentalism in the 1920s. So you just kind of need to know what the Scopes trial is, that it's the evolution versus creation argument, and that it stands for American fundamentalism. Okay, so we go from kind of the cultural aspects of it to kind of a quick discussion over the politics. And really the politics aren't that complicated. You have a rejection of progressivism, particularly a rejection of Democrats, but also the Republican progressivism that we saw under Roosevelt and Taft. And an idea that we're going to go back to normal, whatever normal might be, right? I guess normal implying lack of government control, kind of. So just be sure that you know some of these key names like Harding, Coolidge, Mellon, Hoover, and be sure that you understand that this is government going back to servicing business, and that economic growth is the name of the game, and wealth and power becomes concentrated in the hands of a few. Whether it's few individuals or more likely a few corporations and banks. Warren G. Harding wins the election in 1920, becomes president in 1921. He's kind of an easy, outgoing guy. I don't know if you remember back around Valentine's Day, there was a article floating around the internet about the best love letters of all time. And one of them was a letter from Harding to his mistress, actually talking about how much he loved her and all this kind of stuff. He was a little bit of a hound dog. He liked the ladies, had a couple of mistresses, one of whom he was very impassioned about. Another one had an illegitimate child with him. So he was kind of a hound dog. Not a bad guy, per se. I mean, he didn't, he just was kind of an ordinary Joe Schmo. He brought with him a bunch of people from Ohio. Some of them, of course, Hoover's not necessarily from Ohio, neither is Andrew Mellon, but he brings them with him. He appoints them to cabinet positions. Hoover and Mellon are actually not bad at their job, but Harding does give some other high-level jobs to political friends who do become very involved in corruption, and in fact, his presidency will end largely in scandal in 1923 when he dies of a heart attack. He is the first president on the radio. Some of the scandals, you have the Veterans Bureau that was accepting money from the government but not giving services to veterans. Gee, doesn't that sound familiar? The Attorney General was taking bribes to overlook prohibition. The Teapot Dome scandal, the Secretary of the Interior accepted bribes to allow an oil company to drill in the U.S. national oil reserves. And all of these things really kind of taint his presidency. But Harding, by and large, was not a terrible guy. He's the first president on the radio. Like I said, he was kind of a hound dog. But he wasn't terrible by any means. When he dies, Coolidge will take over for him in 1923. And Calvin Coolidge, who was very kind of quiet, known as Silent Cal, he's also very kind of frugal. Calvin Coolidge will root out the elements of kind of corruption and scandal from Harding's administration, keep the best of those like Mellon and Hoover, and get rid of the rest. The big thing with Harding's foreign policy is the Washington Conference in 1921. This is what eventually ends World War I. And I've mentioned the 4, 5, and 9 power treaties, largely to do the same thing that the Treaty of Versailles does. They just do it in separate agreements. The big term here being the moratorium on the naval race, which of course doesn't quite, have the same impact that they were hoping. We do certainly have an economic depression taking over in 1921 in Europe that kind of ebbs and flows throughout the 1920s until you have really the peak of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. which is part of why Germany will begin to focus so heavily on militarization in the early 1930s. So just kind of know his foreign policy. Some other aspects of the economy. In the 1920s, the U.S. is going to have the highest standard of living. We do have lots of modern conveniences, and most people, regardless of social class, are going to have access to some modern conveniences. So we do have a high standard of living. The problem with that high standard of living is it's largely built on credit. People have borrowed money to buy radios, to buy refrigerators, and this is going to start to create a bubble. Part of the idea was that American prosperity would eliminate Bolshevism and the need for unions. And then we certainly see that Europe is coming to the U.S. with its hands out, saying, help us, we need money. And in the 1920s, you have kind of this attitude that the U.S. is this bottomless pit of resources. And so, sure, why not? We have this, well-stocked store. We can give you whatever we have. Also, sitting behind all of this is an emerging farming crisis. Understand that during World War I, the government had encouraged farmers to grow more and more and more. They had to feed Europe, they had to feed the American Army, and they had to feed America. So they provided low-interest loans to buy more land, to buy the latest equipment, to invest in fertilizers and seed hybrids. And all of this coincides very conveniently with technology and technology advancing. And so you have a lot of farmers by, say, 1921-22 that have a pretty big debt load. And at first, right after World War I, prices are pretty high. And they're like, yeah, this is a good deal. Then about 21-22, prices begin to crash because Europe has rebounded. They're on the recovery. And that's going to make it so that American farmers are struggling. In addition, one of the aspects of the 1920s economy are protective tariffs to protect American manufacturing. Remember, we're becoming very isolationist, and we don't want to have to deal with kind of the impact of foreign competition. And the problem with high protective tariffs is that's going to mean that farmers don't have places to sell their crops. And so you've got farmers where prices are falling because of increased competition, and they have fewer markets to sell their stuff to, and in the meantime, they have borrowed a lot of money to advance their farms, expand their farms, and that kind of thing. So you've got a farming crisis that really begins in the early 1920s. By the time you get to 1926, 27, you've got a number of banks in the Midwest that are focused on farming communities that are starting to go under. Farmers are starting to go belly up. And you see by 1927, Congress is starting to talk about farm relief bills. Now, the problem is Calvin Coolidge is in power, and Calvin Coolidge doesn't believe in having any kind of government relief program. So Coolidge vetoes that. But just understand that as we're going towards the stock market crash, this is what we're looking at, is a farming community that is beginning to struggle and suffer. We have real estate bubbles happening, whether you're talking about Florida or California or the Midwest, and this begins to create some tension. You're going to have Mellon economics. Andrew Mellon is the Secretary of the Treasury. His big goals are balance the federal budget, reduce government debt, and cut taxes. Balancing the federal budget means that he's going to cut programs, cut funding for the enforcement of prohibition, and cut funding for for farm bills and that kind of thing. He creates a department to monitor government spending. He endorses the protective tariffs to help American products. And he supports this idea of supply-side economics, that if we cut taxes, we would ultimately strengthen the economy because people will have more money in their hands to spend. And if I have more money in my hands to spend, then I will buy more products, which will stimulate business growth. And business growth will then put more people to work, and then the government will ultimately collect more taxes. That prosperity trickles down from the rich to the poor. We cut taxes for the business. We cut businesses. We cut taxes for the rich. We cut them for the middle class. And this will stimulate job growth all the way down to the lowest level of the social classes. And that because you have increased demand for products, this will raise wages, which will then allow the government to collect more taxes. And that this will encourage a cycle of investing and spending that will encourage the economy to grow. This idea is not terrible. Okay, it does reduce the federal deficit. It does cut the tax rate. And it is largely successful for stimulating economic growth in the early 1920s. The problem with the Mellon program is it ignores the farming crisis. It ignores the signs like the real estate bubble. It ignores the signs of the consumer credit and those kinds of things that are indicating an economy that's not nearly as strong as it looks like it might be. And so the Mellon economics, supply-side economics, really kind of ignores some key factors. And supply-side economics does work, but it works for a short period of time. It's like giving yourself a shot of adrenaline. If your heart's on the verge of stopping and you need a shot of adrenaline, adrenaline will save your life, no question about it. But if you give yourself too much adrenaline, or if you give yourself adrenaline at the wrong time, it's going to kill you. And that's exactly the way supply-side economics works. And understanding that economics is really kind of this mystical, or always changing, never certain kind of atmosphere, is really what you have to realize and see supply-side economics for what it is, which is just one part of what you can do as a response. And so really the Mellon program, while it does trigger a great deal of prosperity, it is not the only answer for the American economy. Hoover and his associationalism, he was the Secretary of Commerce, and he wants to create a healthy environment for business. So he focuses on trade associations, where different industries will band together to share information, tips on managing production, encouraging fair standards and fair wages and that kind of thing. That company unions are okay within reason. And it's all kind of this way that the government can encourage voluntary cooperation, and that periodically the government would step in if there was a crisis or if there was a conflict. But by and large, industries are allowed to regulate themselves. The idea is that associationalism will end ruthless competition, and that it will essentially encourage cooperation. Now, I point this out because, first off, it's easy to believe this when the economy's good and everybody's making money. It becomes a very different thing when the economy crashes. The other big part of this is this tells us a lot about who Hoover is. And he'll run for president in 1928 and win. And when the stock market crashes in 1929, this is going to be his response. And so we need to understand that this is who Hoover, this is who he is. This is what he's about. So his response to the Great Depression, while it seems very inadequate, if you look at it as a part of his overall attitude going all the way back to World War I and his role with the Food Administration, you can see that this kind of cooperative attitude is a big part of what he advocates for. So to understand Hoover when we get to the Great Depression, it's important to understand his associationalism. Coolidge, I've already mentioned that he is kind of the strong silent type. He wins very easily in 1924 thanks to American prosperity. He'll leave office in 1928 mostly because he hated being president. He hates the media and that kind of thing. The chief business of the American people is business. He's very frugal, eliminates corrupt elements, largely continues Harding's policies. Although his foreign policy does get a little interesting, you see that in 1924 it's become clear that the World War I debt is creating a burden on Europe. And so the U.S. government, who does not want the U.S. taxpayers to shoulder the burden of their excessive loans to the Allies during World War I, they decide to involve the banks and loan even more money, right? So we've got a debtor who's very clearly having trouble paying back their loans. And so we basically loan them even more money. And we loan Germany money to pay Britain and France pay us, and then we loan Germany more money. And we create this kind of cycle of using the same dollar over and over again. And this doesn't really solve the World War I debt problem, just kind of shuffles it around, puts off the eventual collapse. And of course, we'll see that by 1934, Hitler basically says, yeah, we're not paying you back, never mind. And so just kind of keep that in mind. And this kind of goes into what we're reading about in Larson with the obsession with, is Germany going to pay back its war debt? Because this is a part of what the Dawes Plan was all about, was kind of shuffling this money around. We also have the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928 that was meant to outlaw war. Ha ha ha. So much for that. No one really thought much about it at the time. It's just kind of an interesting footnote, given that we're only about 10 years before the beginning of World War II. We do see some signs of distress. The Republican prosperity does not extend to all groups, primarily farmers. They're really, really hurting by the end of the 1920s. But also a great many of your industry workers, your coal miners, those kinds of people, are still struggling. We're going to see that overall by 1928, 1929, the average American is going to see their income shrinking due to debt. People have borrowed money to buy cars, to buy radios, to buy refrigerators. And, of course, this was all well and good in 1925 when we wanted to encourage Americans to consume what American businesses were producing. But by 1929, people don't have any more money they can borrow against. And, of course, we have this whole idea of, keeping production high. And so American factories are continuing to produce at record numbers, assuming that somehow demand is going to magically keep up when people are really reaching their debt limits and they can't do it. In addition, protective tariffs cut off European markets for American businesses, and this creates a problem. So the rise of consumer credit will begin to cripple the working and middle class consumers. Weak unions are going to leave your unskilled labor very vulnerable during this period. You throw into this the Mississippi flood of 27 and the Florida real estate bubble with hurricanes in 1926 and 28. So we begin to have huge segments of the population that can no longer participate in the economy. And by participating in the economy, I mean people who can't go to the store and buy stuff, right? They can't show up and buy goods and services. And, whether you're talking about your middle class family that's maxed out on debt, or whether you're talking about, some kind of upper middle class guy that's invested in, Florida real estate that loses his savings, all of these people are going to start to have trouble participating in the economy. Remember the $33 billion in reparations from Germany. They begin to default, have massive printing of money and runaway inflation, which wipes out the savings of the German middle class. Remember that industrialization had increased the size of the middle class, and the middle class likes their cushy little savings accounts and their nice little house and their nice little knickknacks, and they lose a lot of that because of inflation. And the Dawes Plan will attempt to resolve this default in 1923, but it doesn't really work, right? It just continues to shuffle money around. Germany's always falling behind economically. Britain and France continue to struggle because they need the reparation payments to come over to rebound from World War I. And into all of this, we have tariff battles happening. Beginning of the end of an era, the election of 1928. Mellon's program had led to the illusion of prosperity, despite the farming crisis and despite very clearly by 1928 what had become a process of overproduction. The farmers weren't able to make any money. They were increasingly defaulting on their loans. Companies have way too much stock in their warehouses, but they're essentially lying on their stock portfolios, getting people to continue to buy stock. So they are, paying salaries based on stock purchases that they can't sustain because they have way too much, product in their warehouse. So essentially, you have kind of this system happening with very clear cracks going on. And nobody's paying any attention to it because the stock prices are continuing to rise, and everyone says, oh, this is a bull market, and everything's great. Coolidge doesn't run again, and the Republicans bring Herbert Hoover in. And his characteristics essentially kind of work with Coolidge. He's a kind of the managerial type. I'm going to manage everything. We're going to continue Coolidge's policies. He was for prohibition. And by the time you get to 1928, not everybody's, prohibition is starting to lose some of its favor. But by and large, people were willing to put up with that because of the prosperity. And he starts promising 2 cars in every garage, not just 1 car. And the Democratic Party is a great big mess, and they have Alfred E. Smith, who is a Catholic Irish American. And of course, Americans, kind of nativist, right? They resist Catholicism. So the Democrats are never going to win very big in 1928. Here's a character of Herbert Hoover and an actual picture of him. Hoover gets very maligned because of his response to the Great Depression. And some of that's not really fair. He did the best that he could. He certainly acted in keeping with his overall personality. I don't know that he deserves the blame for the Great Depression. In fact, Coolidge really deserves the blame. As so often happens with presidents, the president in office gets the credit for the boom or the bust, whether or not that president had anything to do with it at all. You look at numbers for Obama, and you can look back and see that some of why his numbers look so good is because of the impact of the recession of 2008 during the last year of George W. Bush's presidency. Clinton got a lot of credit for a booming economy. The reality is the economy was booming because of his predecessor, George H.W. Bush. Bush 41 enacted some policies that actually stimulated the economy, but they just weren't felt until Clinton had taken over. So poor Hoover, he tries to do the best that he can. We'll see that stock prices will soar in 1928 after the election because everyone's thinking, oh, hey, 4 more years of this, 4 more years of, economic growth and, lack of government restrictions and all this kind of stuff. And we've had this big, long bull market where people are buying stock as opposed to selling stock. And so stock prices are way high. Keep in mind that only about 10% of Americans own stock. So when we talk about the stock market crash, understand that while it is a factor in the Great Depression, it alone is not the only cause. Now, it is kind of the moment by which we say the beginning of the Great Depression is October 1929 when the stock market crash hits. And I suppose as kind of a bookmark, it works perfectly fine for that. But a smart history student's going to know that the Great Depression really goes back to this concept of overproduction in the factories, the fact that you had protective tariffs, you had huge consumer credit that was tapped out by 1928, 1929, the farming crisis that was causing banks to fail, Germany's struggle in paying back loans, Britain and France struggle. You've got lots of factors coming into this. And then, of course, the other minor factors, the Mississippi flood, the Florida hurricanes, and that kind of thing. So know that the stock market crash will hurt a minority of Americans, and it will hurt them very badly. But really, it's just one more group of Americans that can no longer participate in the larger American economy. And this is what we saw beginning back in 1925-26 when the farmers are really falling away from the American economy. And by 27 and 28, when people are maxed out on debt and they can no longer afford to participate in the economic system. A big part of the stock market crash is the concept of speculation. Remember that businesses did not have to be honest about their portfolios, about how much stock they had on hand, what kind of contracts they had to sell their stock. So there's no oversight to make sure that they're honest. You have people, investing to get rich quick. I think I mentioned this earlier. They're not investing for actual, business growth and development. They're investing kind of like a gambler would. I'm going to buy low and sell high. And I'm going to hope this all works out okay. Well, it becomes kind of this, the in thing to do, right? It kind of becomes a frenzy. And people start buying on margin, which is basically where they borrow money to buy stocks. I have $10. I want to buy $100 worth of stock, so I go to my stockbroker. I give my stockbroker my $10. He loans me $90, and I agree to pay him back $110. Okay, which is great if I can ultimately sell my stock for $120, $130, $150. But what happens if I can only sell my stock for $110 or $100 or $90? Or what if I can only sell my stock for $50, right? Then I'm still going to lose money because I'm going to owe way more than I actually earned. And so this is kind of what I mean by buying on margin. You borrow money to buy stocks. And the margin call is what's going to happen the day of the stock market crash when stock prices are continuously falling and stockbrokers panic and they pick up the phone and they start calling in their margins. All of this speculation is going to inflate stock values and create kind of more debt by borrowing money to buy stocks. And you're going to have banks that are involved in this, banks that provide kind of the loans to the stockbrokers to buy stocks. You're going to have banks that invest the depositors' money. in the stock market, as opposed to saying, you know what, we're just going to hold on to this. Now, if you have an investment bank, you have to be very open about the fact you're an investment bank, that you're going to take deposits and you're going to invest them to try to increase your earnings, as opposed to your run-of-the-mill checking account, where basically, I mean, you don't earn any return on the money, but it's absolutely guaranteed, right? And you don't have to worry about losing it. Well, back in 1929, that wasn't the case. Banks didn't have to tell you what they did with their deposits. You put your money in your account, and you trusted it would be there, when in reality, the banks could be loaning money to stockbrokers or real estate bubbles or doing whatever they wanted to with it. We saw this kind of happen in 2008. You had some banks that had given out some bad housing loans in kind of the same way, and it brought down a couple of banks, actually. The difference is that thanks to the New Deal, we have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that guarantees deposits, so you don't have to worry about losing the money you put in the bank. September 29, professional investors begin to realize that the stock market is a bubble, that it's built kind of on lies, and you start having professional investors selling out very quietly. By October, your ordinary stockbrokers that aren't kind of on the in track, they're going to figure this out, and they're going to start selling off very quickly, calling in margins, and you're going to have massive stock sales, and this is going to crash prices. So that by October 29th, 1929, stocks are their lowest value, which is 1/3, okay? So if I'd taken my $10 and borrowed $90 to buy $100 worth of stock, and hoping that the stock price would continue to rise, I'm going to take my $100 worth of stock, and I'm going to be doing good to get $30 out of it. In the meantime, I have to pay back, $100 to the stockbroker, plus I've lost my initial investment, and that kind of thing. And that's a very simplified example, but that kind of gives you an idea for what I mean, that this kind of removes a huge segment of people from the economy. They lose everything. And then banks that had loaned money, they lose money, right? They don't have money to invest, and suddenly the whole economy begins to contract and tighten up. So now businesses that need to take out a loan to make their payroll or to cover their overproduction, they can't do so because banks are hurting so bad that they've raised interest rates. So the stock market crash is not the major or only cause of the Great Depression, but it's a symptom of overall economic failure. The middle class and the wealthy realized that the prosperity period was largely a house of cards. And now you have not only farmers, not only kind of your unskilled labor, not only your working class, not only your middle class that have borrowed too much money, but now you have people involved in the stock market. So we have another segment of the population that cannot participate in the economy anymore. Notice the date on this. This is Friday, October 25th. Worst stock crash stemmed by banks, right? Conditions are sound. There's a whole lot of effort in October, November 29 to convince people that the stocks that it's really not that bad. Things are going to come back. We're going to be fine. Just hang in there, right? So really you get to the end of 1929, the beginning of 1930, and there's a little bit of this hum where people are saying, well, maybe it won't be so bad, right? We don't have massive job losses yet. But you're going to start to see by spring of 1930 and certainly by winter of 31, increasing bank failures. Banks that had stretched too thin because of the stock market, banks that had too many loans out, and people for various reasons that can't pay back their loans, they're starting to shut their doors. That creates a panic. People start pulling their savings out of the banks, which means the banks don't have money to loan businesses for expansion or to cover payroll, which means they have to lay workers off. And you begin to have this snowball effect where then workers are laid off and they don't have any money to spend, so they can't participate in the economy. So then there's no money going into the bank, so the banks have even less money to loan out. And it just kind of creates the snowball effect that begins to affect a lot of different people. And so we have no deposit insurance. Bank failures are a major issue. And this will continue to be the case into 1932. And in fact, really 1932, 33, you'll have another major crash of the banks when FDR wins the election. And banks get kind of panicky over what is he going to do next. And again, this is very similar to what we saw with the real estate bubble a few years ago. where banks had loaned out too much money in bad housing loans. Similar kind of scenario. The only difference is we had systems in place with the FDIC and with the government response that was able to prevent kind of this wholesale free-for-all where suddenly banks are shutting down and there's no money moving in the economy, and so people are losing jobs. And we still saw pretty large unemployment in 2008. And so just kind of keep that in mind as kind of a current context. Multiple causes of the Great Depression. The stock market crash triggers a recession and an economic contraction. An unregulated, decentralized banking system. Thanks, Andrew Jackson. Even though we had a Federal Reserve that had been put in place in 1916, it's brand new. And they're just figuring out what it is they're supposed to be doing. Plus, they had a lot of conservative leadership. And they're not sure what to do. They kind of overreact to the stock market crash, and they actually raise interest rates, which contracts the economy even more. Overproduction creates too many products. They run out of consumers. Because mass production linked multiple industries to each other, when one industry begins to contract, all the others do too. And so you start to see a slowing economy, and you start to see rising unemployment by 1927, which is not something you always attribute with the Roaring Twenties. You think of the Roaring Twenties as being, it was all a gigantic Great Gatsby party until suddenly the stock market crashed. Well, that's not really true. You have about 3 years of a Great Gatsby party, and then you start to have this kind of wind down, the hangover beginning to take on. Uneven wealth distribution. In 1929, 5% of American households earned 30% of the nation's income. So that means that the majority of the income is held by a small number of people. Those people do okay. But the rest of the income is distributed among a lot of other people, and they begin to hurt financially. And so that begins to produce a drag on the economy. This is why when you think about the story of Little Orphan Annie and Daddy Warbucks, this is why Daddy Warbucks still has money, because he's one of those 5% that had the majority of the American wealth, right? And certainly the Depression will allow them to have kind of their pick of products because people will be so desperate to sell everything. Businesses had been too profit-minded. They hadn't raised wages enough, and they eventually priced their own employees out of being consumers. They don't listen to Henry Ford, right? We see that's kind of something that Walmart's starting to do when talking about raising wages, is that we want our workers to be able to buy stuff at our store. And if they have to go to the dollar store instead of coming to Walmart to buy their stuff, then we got a problem. You also have restricted foreign markets, and this kind of reduces American purchasing power. If expanding foreign markets would have compensated for American reduced purchasing power, except, of course, that we have too much money loaned out. We also have in 1930 the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raises tariffs to record levels as a reaction, trying to help American production. And by 1932, U.S. exports are 1/5 of what they were in 1929. And it's hurting everybody, farmers and manufacturers. Again, the Federal Reserve, created by Wilson to monitor the money supply and create confidence in the banks, does the exact opposite by raising interest rates, making it very difficult for banks to operate, so banks start closing. And the Federal Reserve kind of sits back there and says, oh, gee, I don't know what to do, right? They are very, very conservative during this period, and this is going to create some issues for them. So causes of the Great Depression, the 1920s farming crisis, overproduction and unequal wealth distribution, the stock market crash and bank failures, loss of foreign markets, and then mismanagement of interest rates. And so this is kind of what we see happening in 1929. The effects of the Great Crash, it does not cause the Great Depression on its own, but it certainly damages the economy and is the start of the worst depression in history. All the economic gains of the 1920s are wiped out by 1932, and wages and income are cut in half. 85,000 businesses have failed by 1932, and this creates a global ripple effect where American banks that have propped up fragile European economies, because they're going under, they're demanding their payments. This triggers kind of a tightened economy in Europe, which again kind of spurs, kind of the rise of totalitarianism, Why does Hitler want to encourage military production? Well, because Germany's struggling financially too, like everybody else. And of course, part of why the U.S. is not going to be as focused on the rise of totalitarianism in the 1930s is because we're trying to fix the Great Depression. By 1931, many countries had abandoned the gold standard to create a flexible money supply that they could print. And they start to raise tariffs in their own lands to protect their own markets. And so this will drop crop prices even more, causing more loan defaults and rural bank closures. And this will create panics that will spread to the cities and cause cities to have bank runs. And again, this just makes the whole depression even worse. Throw into this the environmental damage of the Dust Bowl due to overproduction because of World War I. Produce, produce, produce. Don't pay any attention to what you're doing to the ground. And they will overproduce so much that they create essentially a major drought and a major environmental circumstance. Very similar in a lot of ways to fracking and the hydraulic fracking that goes on in driving to kind of push out this whole system of basically kind of oil reserves and that kind of thing, trying to make that better. And so you see that we've kind of created these sort of small dog crisis. Anyways, okay, so the global context is that, we have kind of this emerging kind of environmental crisis in the United States. We certainly have a depression. The global depression rocks the fragile democracies that had been created because of the Treaty of Versailles, and this is going to encourage the rise of dictators and totalitarian states. The U.S. will turn further towards itself with isolationism, and we're going to have the rise of militarism and territorial expansion in Europe to solve economic problems. You'll also see that happening in Japan as well. So this is very much the context that we see going into Larson's book. So I hope it puts all of this in context. Hopefully I've been able to give this to you in person, but if not, here we go. We have this. And then hopefully we will have school at some point this week. Thank you very much.